In this pod-slice summary of the Triggernometry podcast, Douglas Murray critically analyses the support for Palestine in his home city, London, against the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He expresses shock and frustration at the speedy show of support, which he views as not being in solidarity with Palestinians as much as it is against Israel. Murray also profoundly questions the motives behind the pro-Palestinian support, arguing that the Middle Eastern countries surrounding Palestine do not genuinely care for the well-being of the Palestinians. He compares the Palestinian situation to other regions in which Muslims have suffered, such as Yemen and Syria, and posits that there is a deficit of proportionate outrage or action. He attributes this disparity to an undercurrent of anti-Semitism in the Islamic world, arguing the driving force behind such support is not the love of fellow Muslims, but hate for Jews. There is something at the very root of Islam and followers of the Muslim religion who cannot bear any war in which Israel is fighting, and most of all loathes any war in which Israel is winning, Murray maintains. He traces this alleged anti-Semitism back to the founder of Islam, Muhammad, pointing out that Muhammad was known to have beheaded and massacred many Jews during his lifetime. In this context, he also addresses the paradoxical idea of Islam being the final revelation and the subsequent crisis this has posed for the Islamic culture and nations over the centuries. He criticizes the Middle Eastern states for failing to progress economically and socially, despite this supposed superiority, with the notable exception of Israel. Comparing the future prospect of Palestine to the unsuccessful history of other Arab nations, he suggests that the underlying resentment comes from an inability to accept the success of Israel, a state founded by Jews who refused the invitation to join Islam. Murray also explored the popularity of pro-Palestinian sentiment amongst young people in recent weeks, labelling it as fantastic ignorance. He criticizes the education system for failing to teach enough about this highly nuanced geopolitical situation, which, to him, has resulted in equating support for Palestine as justifying genocide. He provides an insightful, albeit controversial and debatable lens through which to examine the prevailing pro-Palestinian sentiments, shedding light on the intricate historical, religious and cultural factors that potentially underlie this support. His comments, firmly rooted in his own perspective, offer a powerful stimulant for debate and further exploration of this enduring and complex conflict. In the Triggernometry podcast, Douglas Murray continues to discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the narratives being pushed by different groups of people. He expresses concern about what he perceives as the misperceptions and misrepresentations that are influencing public opinion, particularly among young people, and further fueling anti-Israel sentiment. He argues that young people are being indoctrinated into a somewhat twisted interpretation of history, one that paints Israel as the colonizing oppressor and Palestinians as the human rights-deprived victims, analogous to a flawed understanding of American racial history. According to Murray, this ideology ignores the complexity of history and diverse perspectives, oversimplifying the Israeli-Palestinian conflict into a binary dynamic of oppressor-oppressed. Furthermore, Murray challenges this popular pro-Palestinian narrative by arguing that it perpetuates a gross misunderstanding of colonial and post-colonial history, particularly in relation to the Middle East. He suggests that these simplifications of history, driven by a form of anti-colonial sentiment, are being unfairly applied to the Israeli-Palestinian context. Another alarming condensation of the conflict, according to Murray, is the comparison of Israelis to Nazis and the accusations of genocide. He vehemently disagrees with this interpretation, insisting that the claim of genocide against Palestinians is factually incorrect. This, he argues, is not only evident in the increasing population numbers in Gaza, but also in the incomparable difference between the situation in Palestinian territories and war-torn regions like Syria and Yemen. He then outlines what he identifies as a deliberate tactic taken from anti-Israel voices within the Muslim community, accusing Israel of acting like the Nazis to inflict the maximum emotional pain on Jews due to their historical suffering. These narrative elements, he believes, serve to dehumanize Israel and are picked up by misinformed supporters of Palestinians, further tainting the discourse surrounding the conflict. He also asserts that the Palestine Authority and Hamas's vision of a Jew-free Palestine is concerning because it calls for, in his words, either the eradication of all Jews in Israel or the displacement of all Jews in Israel. This implied genocide or mass displacement, he argues, is ironically the very thing that these pro-Palestinian activists claim they stand against. Douglas Murray criticizes the double standards that apply to Israel and the selective outrage from the international community that he perceives. The argument of proportionality, according to him, seems to hold Israel to a unique standard that is simultaneously unattainable and defies each nation's right to self-defense. He believes calls for proportionality only exist to make Israel lose, citing the failure of the UN to pass a resolution to condemn the attacks on the 7th of October as evidence. The podcast portrays a deeply nuanced perspective, criticizing the cherry-picking and reductionist depiction of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that paints Israel as an oppressor without considering historical, geopolitical, religious and cultural complexities. Douglas Murray's comments are, as always, deeply controversial, but offer a fresh lens to the pervasive pro-Palestinian sentiments that dominate the geopolitical discussion. Douglas Murray delves deeper into the topic of anti-Semitism on the Triggernometry podcast, describing it as a shape-shifting virus that adapts its reasons for discrimination throughout history. From religious persecution to racial discrimination to the scorn for being stateless, and eventually the criticism of having a state, Jews have faced prejudice in various forms. Murray uses the example of major historical figures such as the renowned Russian novelist Vasyl German, who addressed the issue of anti-Semitism in his work. German's exploration of anti-Semitism reveals that this form of hatred says more about the hater than the hated, highlighting how it often reflects the insecurities and prejudices of the perpetrators rather than the victims. In this portion, Murray also criticizes the West's understanding and reaction to conflict. Using Britain's handling of the Manchester Arena bombing and the murder of Sir David Amos as examples, he argues that Western societies often avoid dealing with harsh realities, preferring peaceful rhetoric over confronting the issues surrounding terrorism directly. Murray further accentuates this disparity by comparing it with Israel's approach to security. As a nation that strictly regulates its borders, Israel symbolizes a stark contrast to European countries that he asserts have moved beyond the concept of borders and defense. He sees European attitudes toward Israel's defensive measures as being tinged with an unforgiving resentment towards a country that is merely ensuring its sovereignty. A significant point made by Murray is that Britain, like many other Western states, is deeply confused about defence, borders, and national identities. This confusion, he posits, limits their understanding of serious threats and situations that require immediate and decisive action, as is required by Israel. The conversation then broadens to include the host's viewpoints. Host Francis echoes Murray's claim that many people in Britain are terrified of discussing real threats due to the fear that they could personally become victims. However, both hosts and Murray criticize this fear, arguing that it leads to the silencing of discussions about ideological extremism, whether it's Islamic extremism or neo-Nazism. Murray re-emphasizes the significance of recognizing the motives behind terrorist acts, condemning the selective outrage or silence depending on the ideological leanings of the perpetrator. He argues this double standard and the accompanying fear contribute to a crippling inability to address these issues directly and adequately. As the podcast segment concludes, the hosts lead into a short break with an advertisement for a crowdfunding service called Give and Go. Upon the return, Murray picks up the discussion by strongly concurring with Francis on a lack of open conversation about real threats due to fear. Douglas Murray, Konstantin Kisin, and Francis discuss the sentiments of the British public and the government's inaction towards perceived threats within the UK, particularly focusing on individuals who glorify and practice terrorism. Citing a poll showing significant support for deporting such individuals from both Conservative and Labour voters, Murray argues for the need to prioritise national security over liberal values. Mentioning specific figures like the former military commander of Hamas, Mohammed Salah, living in North London, and the former Deputy Prime Minister Iran, Maharani, in Harrow, Murray questions their right to remain in the UK due to their questionable pasts. He suggests that their presence shows a disregard for the nation's security and well-being. Further, he proposes stricter measures, such as withdrawing citizenship and deportation, are necessary steps to ensure national security. This approach to immigration, they argue, should be based on whether it benefits the country, a sentiment reiterated by American presidential candidate Ron DeSantis. They criticize the ongoing hesitation to discuss and act upon these national security issues due to the fear of violating free speech rights. Addressing the handling of recent protests across the UK, Douglas criticises the policing strategy, arguing that it fails to prevent incidents but focuses on penalising after the fact. The hosts add even when people commit hate speech-related crimes, they aren't always prosecuted, invoking instance where individuals from Blackburn who had used a megaphone to incite violence against Jewish women were neither prosecuted nor punished. Murray criticises the Metropolitan Police's actions, removing posters of missing Jewish children during the protests, suggesting if the police fail to protect the public will eventually have to step in. He implies that the perception of being in a minority shouldn't deter individuals from opposing actions that threaten national security or public order. He concludes by stating that while the demographic situation in the UK is different from other countries like the USA, the public should not feel helpless and must act against attempts to undermine public safety. Douglas Murray, Konstantin, Kisin and Francis delve deeper into the role of the UK police in ensuring public safety and their perceived bias in dealing with community tensions. According to Murray, it's problematic that the police believe the display of posters seeking help to find missing Jewish children could incite conflicts. This viewpoint, he says, reflects views held by several politicians, particularly certain Muslim politicians across the UK. In a frank discussion, they argue that those who find such posters offensive should leave the UK because it is the people who instigate fear, menace, and social unrest who should feel threatened, not those who are peaceful. Strikingly, Murray reveals he has friends from around the world, including Jewish ones, who've been asking if it's still safe to travel to Britain, especially London. Reflecting on demographics, they point out that Jews are a minority in the UK, vastly outnumbered by the large Muslim community as well as the rest of the British population. Their perspective asserts that the British public, by and large, still take pride in the UK's history. They mention that despite decades of efforts to demonise UK's contributions to the world, these sentiments are only held by a small group in control of institutional narratives. Murray expresses concern about the UK's political landscape, emphasising that many promises from political parties, both right and left, never materialise. Interestingly, he highlights that more people are members of the Birdwatchers Association than all UK political parties combined, indicative of the public's lack of faith in political actions. Murray fears this may lead to extra political reactions on the streets as the public's endurance reaches its limit under perceived threats and unfulfilled promises. Acknowledging the potential for unpleasant consequences following this path of public discontent, Murray insists that the suppression of these issues will inevitably lead to a boiling point, possibly resulting in vigilante justice unless the government takes tangible action. Then, they touch on the media's role, specifically the BBC, in failing to bridge the gap between the public and the political discourse, hinting that they may continue to explore this theme in future discussions. Check out the full podcast by clicking the link in the description below. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for listening to this podcast summary episode of the Pod Slice.